Following the Nuremberg trials, 7 former members of the Third Reich government were imprisoned in Spandau. But what is not very well known about their fate is what life was actually like for those Nazi prisoners behind these walls. Among them was Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, sentenced to life in prison. He would never see freedom again. He died behind these very prison walls. Others, like Hitler's architect Albert Speer and Hitler Youth leader Baldur von Schirach, served their time and were eventually released. Yet, it was Hess who remained the last prisoner standing. In the years after the Nuremberg trials, Spandau became more than just a prison. It was a living testament to the horrors that had shaped Europe. But beyond the sentences and the trials, what was it truly like inside? What did these men, whose names had forever changed the course of history, experience each day? In this video, we pull back the iron bars of history to reveal the untold story of the final Nazis locked away at Spandau. Spandau Prison was originally designed to hold hundreds of inmates, but after the Nuremberg trials, only 7 men remained. These prisoners, each assigned a number, were isolated from the rest of the world, their lives controlled and scrutinized by the 4 occupying powers of Berlin: the French, the British, the Soviets, and the Americans. Each power took turns running the prison every few months. And with each occupying force, the conditions varied. The Soviets, known for their brutal approach, enforced the harshest rules, while the Americans, British, and French were more lenient. But for the prisoners, life behind bars was still defined by strict regimentation. The men were separated in different cells, the isolation was absolute. The prison was surrounded by multiple high walls, topped with electrified wire, and manned by over 60 guards, including machine gun towers. With no chance of escape, these once powerful figures found themselves prisoners not just of the Allies, but of their own pasts. Every single day inside Spandau was meticulously planned, with no room for deviation. The prisoners' routine was designed to ensure they remained isolated, monitored, and kept under constant control. The day began promptly at 6 a.m. Each prisoner was woken up and ordered to wash and clean their cells. Then, they gathered in the corridor, separated from each other by thick walls and strict surveillance. Breakfast was served, but only the bare minimum, enough to keep them alive, but not enough to sustain any sense of comfort. When the weather was pleasant, they were allowed to spend some time in the prison yard, a rare chance to experience fresh air and the outside world, but even here, they were closely watched. The garden, surrounded by high walls, offered little relief. By midday, they were back in their cells for a short rest, followed by a modest lunch. But there were no luxuries, no moments of relaxation. Every moment was dictated by the prison's iron grip. Even their communications with the outside world were limited. Prisoners were allowed to write 1 letter a month, and it was always scrutinized. No newspapers, no books outside of the prison's limited library. Their letters were short, their world incredibly small. Family visits were allowed, but they were strictly controlled, just 15 minutes every 2 months. The harshest of all the rules? They were not allowed to speak to each other. Silence reigned supreme. In the early years, the strictness of their incarceration was relentless. Yet, as the years wore on, the situation softened, especially under the American and British forces. But the Soviets, who had borne the heaviest losses during the war, insisted on maintaining the most brutal conditions. Even the smallest of pleasures were taken from the prisoners. Though some, like Albert Speer, did everything they could to stay mentally active. He walked daily in the prison yard, creating elaborate daydreams of traveling the world, imagining his journey across continents. He would walk miles each day, and over time, he convinced himself that by the end of his sentence, he would have walked the equivalent of 30,000 kilometers. But while some prisoners found ways to cope, others, like Hess, were far less resilient. The deputy Führer refused to participate in any work, often making excuses about his health, and he spent the majority of his time alone, moaning in pain, or so he claimed. His behavior would raise suspicion among the guards, with many wondering if he was truly ill or simply playing a dangerous game. Despite the strict isolation, the prisoners of Spandau couldn't escape their pasts, and their personalities continued to clash, just as they had during the war. The dynamics inside the prison were far from peaceful. In fact, the old rivalries among Hitler's inner circle only grew more intense behind bars. Rudolf Hess, once the deputy Führer, was not only the laziest of the prisoners but also the most enigmatic. His refusal to engage in any work, his constant complaints about his health, and his apparent refusal to acknowledge the reality of his situation made him a difficult prisoner to manage. He was constantly at odds with the other inmates, and they mocked him for his behavior. They dubbed him his imprisoned lordship, a mocking title that reflected both their disdain for his inaction and the fact that, in many ways, he had become a relic of a bygone era. Hess's mental state seemed to deteriorate as the years passed. Guards reported hearing him scream at night, as though in agony. But was it genuine suffering, or was it another form of manipulation? Many believed he was simply playing the victim, demanding sympathy from those around him. Albert Spee, on the other hand, showed remarkable resilience. Though he was also stuck within the prison's oppressive walls, Spee took every opportunity to stay busy. He tried to maintain his physical and mental fitness, creating a sense of purpose even in the most dire of circumstances. Spee wasn't the only one attempting to keep busy. Admiral Karl Donitz, who had served as Hitler's successor for a brief time, and his fellow prisoner, Admiral Erich Raeder, spent their time in the prison library. Raeder, known as the Librarian of Spandau, along with Donitz, would maintain a semblance of order within their lives, even creating their own insignia for their duties as keepers of the library. But this wasn't all about maintaining their roles. In reality, the two men seemed to find comfort in their shared routine, becoming inseparable, despite the tensions that ran deep between them. There were other friendships, too, but they were often fraught with the same type of rivalry that had defined their time as high-ranking Nazi officials. Baldur von Schirach, the Hitler Youth leader, and Fritz Funk, the former head of the Reichsbank, formed an inseparable bond. Von Schirach, who had once been the face of Nazi youth propaganda, found himself in strange company. But his relationship with Funk was one of the few true friendships forged behind the walls of Spandau. But despite the friendships, one thing was clear: the men, even in prison, held tightly to their Nazi ideals. There was little remorse, and arguments frequently broke out, driven by old loyalties to Hitler and the party. The men would often find themselves sent back to their cells after particularly heated disputes, only to stew in their own frustrations. The tension that existed in Spandau was not just physical, it was psychological. The prisoners were not merely isolated by walls, they were isolated by their ideologies, their broken minds, and their inability to move past the world they had once ruled. And in many ways, the prison itself became a reflection of the fractured lives they had left behind, a life of power and control that now seemed as distant as the war itself. After decades of incarceration, the last chapter of Spandau's story was written when Rudolf Hess, the final prisoner, died under mysterious circumstances. On August 17, 1987, Hess was found dead in the prison's reading room. The official cause? Suicide. But the question still lingers: was it truly suicide, or was there something more sinister at play? For years, rumors swirled that Hess's death was not as it seemed. Some believed he was murdered to prevent his release, others speculated that a growing network of supporters had been behind it. Whatever the truth, Hess's death marked the end of an era, and the end of Spandau itself. In 1987, after his death, the prison was demolished. The Allies wanted to ensure that it would never become a shrine for those who had been locked away there. The bricks were ground into powder and either buried at an old RAF base or dumped into the North Sea. Spandau's legacy was erased from the map, but the stories of the men who spent their final years within its walls remain, shrouded in mystery and controversy. Today, nothing remains of Spandau. Only the stories of the final Nazis, their lives behind bars, and the enigma surrounding Hess's death live on, a chilling reminder of the past that will never be forgotten.